Good day, ma'am. It's Nurfaida Asarakil. For today's video, I am going to discuss the following. To begin with the genre is any form or type of communication in any mode with socially agreed upon conventions developed over time. Literary genres refer specifically to books and writing, as opposed to other types of media such as movies. Many bookstores organize large quantities of books according to literary genres such as classic, mystery, and fantasy. Next, I am going to explain the five major genres of children's literature. First is the poetry. It is a literature that evokes a concentrated imaginative awareness of experience or specific emotional response through language chosen and arrangement of the meaning, sound, and rhythm. Fiction. It is a literature created from the imagination, not presented as fact, so it may be based on a true story or situation. Non-fiction. It is a literature that, regardless of the subject matter, has a simple goal, which is to provide information. It should be based on the facts and conclusions of the author's research or expertise as opposed to the creativity of the author's imagination. Drama. It is a written work that tells a story through action and speech and is meant to be acted on a stage, which is the play or a play movie or television production with a serious tone or subject, dramatic art, literature, or affairs. And lastly, we have the prose. Prose is an ordinary language that follows regular grammatical conventions and does not contain a formal metrical structures. Next, I am going to discuss the fantasy. At the same time, differentiate between a high fantasy and a low fantasy. Fantasy is a genre of speculative fiction involving magical elements, typically set as a fictional universe and sometimes inspired by mythology and folklore. Its roots are in oral traditions, which then became fantasy literature and drama. From the 20th century, it has expanded further into various media, including film, television, graphic novels, manga, animations, and video games. The difference between the high fantasy and the low fantasy is that the high fantasy refers to epic fantasy, which is set in an alternate world. It typically includes lots of magical elements, fantastical creatures, and unusual technology. Whereas low fantasy is when magical creatures and elements intrude upon the regular world. On the other hand, low fantasy or intrusion fantasy is a subgenre of fantasy fiction in which magical events intrude on the otherwise normal world. The term thus contrasts with high fantasy stories which take place in the fictional worlds that have their own sets of rules and physical laws. The following are the types of fantasies. High or epic fantasy. It is set in a magical environment that has its own rules and physical laws. These subgenres, plots, and themes have a grand scale and typically center on a single, well-developed hero or a band of heroes, such as Frodo Baggins and his cohorts. Low fantasy. It is set in the real world. Low fantasy includes unexpected magical elements that shock characters, like the plastic figurines come to life in lean reed banks. Magical realism. Magical realism characters accept fantastical elements like levitation and telekinesis as a normal part of their otherwise realistic world, as in Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the classic one. Next is the sword and sorcery, a subset of high fantasy. It focuses on the sword-wielding heroes such as the titular barbarian in Robert E. Howard's Conan Pulp, which is the fiction stories. Next is the dark fantasy. It is combining elements of fantasy and horror. Its aim is to unnerve and frighten readers, like the gargantuan, otherworldly monster in H.P. Lovecraft's universe. Fables. Using personified animals and the supernatural. Fables impart moral lessons like the stories in Aesop, Fables, and Arabian Nights. Fairy tales intended for children. These fairy tales and Folk tales are typically set in the distant magical worlds with beginnings like once upon a time in a land far away, and other supernatural characters are in accepted truth. Superhero fiction. Unlike stories in which a hero acquires special abilities through scientific means, such as exposure to tradition, these protagonists' powers are supernatural. Next, what is science fiction? Science fiction is a genre of speculative fiction which typically deals with imaginative and futuristic concepts such as advanced science and technology, space exploration, time travel, parallel universes, and extraterrestrial life. Science fiction can trace its roots to ancient mythology. Next, what is historical fiction? Historical fiction is a set in real place during culturally recognizable time. The details and the action in the story can be a mix of actual events and the ones from the author's imagination as they fill in the gaps. Okay. Realistic fiction. Realistic fiction creates imaginary characters and situations that depict our world and society. The following are the types of realistic fiction. First, humorous stories. It is a genre in which the main emphasis is on humor. These books are designed to make the reader laugh through amusement and most often work by exaggerating characteristics for humorous effect. Animal stories. It is a traditional form of allegorical writing. Animal tales can be understood in universal terms of how animal species relate to each other. Next, sports stories. Sports story is a form of writing that reports on matters pertaining to sporting topics and competitions. School stories. The school story is a fiction genre centering on older pre-adolescent and adolescent school life at its most popular in the first half of the 20th century. Lastly is the mystery. Mystery is a fiction genre where the natural of an event, usually a murder or other crime, remains mysterious until the end of the story. Next, what are the nonfiction books? Nonfiction or the nonfiction is any document or media content that attempts in a good faith to convey information only about the real world rather than being grounded in imagination. So the following are the types of multicultural literature. First, African American. African Americans are an ethnic group consisting of American with partial or total ancestry from the sub-Sahara Africa. Next, ASEAN Pacific American, which is a person living in the United States whose family originally come from the Far East, Southeast Asia, South Asia, or the Pacific Islands. Latino, a person of Latin American origin or descent, especially one living in the United States, which is a growing population of Latinos in the Midwest. Narrative America. Native Americans are people from one of the many groups who were already living in the North America before Europeans arrived, especially those groups in the continental United States. Religious cultures. Religious faith involves belief and trust in a deity or other spiritual force seen as setting standards of conduct responding to prayer and typically ensuring the ultimate triumph of good over evil. Next, American. An American is someone who was born in the United States or born to American parents. It is someone who has migrated here and gone through the necessary processes to become a citizen. Next are children's poetry books. These poems are perfect for young children to enhance their vocabulary and practice their reading skills. This includes Twinkle, Twinkle Little Star, Bah Bah, Black Sheep, The Purple Cow, I'm a Little Teapot, and so many more. Fables. Fable run narrative form usually featuring animals that behave and speak as human beings, told in order to highlight human follies and weaknesses. Myths. Myths are the stories that are passed down about how or why something came to be. Legends. Legends are designed to teach a lesson about a real person in history with a few facts dramatically changed. Tall tales, all to all tale narrative that depict the wild adventures of extravagantly exaggerated folk heroes. Okay. Next, what are realistic tales? It is a genre consisting of stories that could have actually occurred to people or animals in a believable setting. These stories resemble real life, and fictional characters within these stories react similarly to real people, including the folk tales. Folk tales are stories in the oral tradition or tales that people tell each other out loud rather than stories in written form. They are closely related to many storytelling traditions, including the fables, myths, and the fairy tales. Next, what are trickster tales? Trickster tale in oral traditions worldwide is a story featuring a protagonist who has magical powers and who is characterized as a compendium of opposites. Next are the noodlehead stories. These are stories in which a well-intentioned characters takes instructions too literally or usually with comical results. For example, the Amelia Bedelia series. Lastly is the Mother Goose stories. Mother Goose is often cited as the author of hundreds of children's stories that have been passed down through oral tradition and published over centuries. The first printed publication of Mother Goose stories came into in 1965.